Hey everyone, Marshal Cor Leonis was recently announced today, earlier in the global livestream, and with him being a new character, I thought I'd do a quick video covering an overview of his kit, what he brings to the table, and a rough opinion on how valuable he is. Quick disclaimer before I start that first of all, since the only official information about him is currently on the global livestream, the following few slides are taken directly from there to maintain accuracy as much as possible. And secondly, the opinion part is vastly based on just what we currently know about his kit. Obviously, no one has had the opportunity to play test him yet, and that opinion can of course change after some amount of play testing. So, overview on Cor's kit. The global devs describe him as sort of like a linked attacker, and the unique thing about him is that he provides a unique frame buff to one ally that buffs the attack and max brave, as well as reducing Brv and HP damage taken. But the other interesting thing about this buff is that it also triggers a preemptive strike from Cor anytime that ally takes a turn. And the notable thing is that this preemptive strike or off-turn damage happens at the start of turn, which really differentiates him versus other characters with follow-up attacks. The most commonly used one would be Young, where the follow-up attack is triggered after the ally has taken an action. I will also be covering about his LD on a later slide, but as you can see here, he is also in global currently the first character that has rainbow damage. So quick overview about his command abilities and his EX ability. Both his S1 and S2 is pretty straightforward. His S1 is more single target and his S2 is more focused on AoE damage. Both of his attacks battery the entire party, so in a way similar to what Gladiolus does with his kit. Notably, both his S1 or S2 provides his unique ally buff called Oath of Absolute Defense, and this is the buff that provides the various benefits to the single target ally, as well as triggering his preemptive strike every time the ally takes a turn. And you can see the buffs outlined at the bottom right hand side of the screen. It does provide 40% attack and max brave, and while this may seem somewhat low, keep in mind that this is not his only form of party aura, and later on when I run through his LD overhead, you will see that his LD also does provide additional attacks and max brave, which stacks with this unique buff. His EX Lion's Roar does very nice AoE damage and also provides himself with his unique buff called One of Lucis' Tree, which essentially is very similar to the ally buff and will also trigger his preemptive strike every time his turn comes up. Notably, both his ally buff and his health buff lasts for 6 turns and 8 turns, and with his ally buff tied to his S1 and S2 and his self buff tied to his EX ability, which has a normal recast speed, under normal circumstances you can rest assured that Cor will have these buffs up 100% of the time. Notably, and this is really the biggest part of his kit, is his additional attack or so-called preemptive strike. He does 3 hit AoE Brave and split AoE HP damage every time the ally with the Oath of Absolute Defense has a turn, or every time he takes a turn. And likewise, if an enemy is targeting that ally or himself, it will also trigger his preemptive strike. If the boss is targeting the entire party or targeting all, it will trigger 2 of his preemptive strikes, and this is another huge difference between him and other off-turn damage characters. Now, just by looking at his kit from a general glance, some people might get the misperception that his follow-up attack isn't as effective as, say, Young or Cloud of Darkness, for example, mainly on the basis that it affects one character rather than both allies in the party. However, this is really a misperception, as it really depends on how you build your team, and depending on your team composition, you can actually emphasize more on his strengths rather than his weaknesses, and he can then do significantly more damage than Young or Cloud of Darkness in terms of follow-up attack alone. The notable thing to keep in mind that differentiates him from Young and Cloud of Darkness is his often damage is triggered at the start of the ally turn or boss's turn, and not after an action has been taken by the ally or the boss. And this has implications to gameplay, and I'll go through that on the next slide. So what I've done here is just laid out a few common situations that you face, and where Young, as a typical often follow-up attacker, will trigger his attack versus where Cor will trigger his attack. The basis for this slide is really not to draw direct comparisons between these two characters, as I believe both characters have their strengths and merits, but it's more to highlight how useful Cor can be depending on how you build your party, and that's a very important takeaway in my opinion. So first of all, the most common scenario I guess is when the buffed ally, and buffed here refers to the unique buff that Cor can provide, gets a turn. Cor will obviously trigger his often damage. Young will also trigger his often damage here because it doesn't matter who acts, as long as Young's LD buff is up, he will do his full-up attack. Young has the slight advantage over Cor in the sense where if the third party member gets a turn, Young still does his follow-up attack, whereas in Cor's case, if you use him as the off-turn damager, he won't trigger his follow-up attack because this third party does not have his unique buff up. When boss targets the so-called unbuffed ally as well, Cor in the same way will not trigger his follow-up attack, whereas Young does not discriminate on this because it's based on his LD buff, so Young will still trigger his LD follow-up attack here. However, if you look at other situations, such as if the boss or ally gets a turn but they are disabled, for example if they are paralyzed or confused, Young will not be able to trigger his follow-up attack because it's based on actions taken rather than turns. This is where Cor really differentiates himself. Doesn't matter if the boss is paralyzed or disabled or confused, as long as the turn comes up, Cor will trigger his preemptive strike and deal damage that way. Another big difference, and this can potentially be huge depending on the fight and the party setup, is if the boss is targeting all and the boss gets a turn, Young will trigger one follow-up attack after the boss's turn, but in Cor's case, he does his preemptive strike twice when the boss gets a turn. Now before I move on, I just want to quickly look at scenario 2 and 3, where if the unbuffed ally acts and if the boss targets an unbuffed ally, this isn't a very big detriment to Cor. It just means that you need to think about these scenarios and plan accordingly. If you've used the Terra and Young combo before, you realize that the third party member is usually some sort of slow aura bot, such as Garland with his BT aura or Butts with his BT aura. So in a normal scenario, the third party member would not get that many turns anyway, as they are designed to be as low as possible to provide as long as possible the BT buff or BT aura to the party. So it really isn't a big detriment. At most, you'll just be missing out a few often damage attacks from Cor as compared to Young. The third scenario, which is if the boss targets an unbuffed ally, can actually be fully mitigated if you combine Cor with a locked tank. So for example, with Warrior of Light recently released, if Warrior of Light uses his Throw Buckler or his LD, he will lock on all enemies to himself. Another good example is Celeste, because she was also recently featured as well. If either of these tanks are in the party and they lock all the bosses onto them, Cor can then just use his unique buff on the locked tank, and therefore you will ensure that the boss always targets an ally that is buffed by his unique buff. So there are ways to play around this in a sense, and that way you can actually maximize Cor getting into situations where his often damage will be triggered, and minimize situations where his often damage will not be triggered. It doesn't end there. This slide from the global livestream shows what Cor's LD provides to his kit, and it is a very notable difference as well. So first of all, upon use of his LD, he gets an overhead buff called King's Power Within, and this provides significant buffs to the party. So attack and max brave of 40%, stolen brave overflow of 30%, and brave and HP damage of 10%, which might not seem like a lot, but in my opinion is actually quite huge, considering that his role is more of a DPS character rather than a support. Keep in mind though that on the earlier slide, you've seen that his self buff from his EX and his unique buff on the ally does already provide buffs to attack and max brave. The ally buff provides 40% attack and max brave, and his self buff provides 40% attack and 50% max brave to himself. It actually stacks with the LD. So this means that with Cor in the party and his LD overhead is up, the ally that is buffed with his unique buff gets 80% attack and 80% max brave, and he gets 80% attack and 90% max brave boost, which is quite decent for a DPS character. And combine this with the brave and HP damage up, which in my book is always welcome. He does add a lot to the team, and depending on the fight and your call abilities, it may even be possible to do the Lufenia fight without a pure aura bot or support character, but that's, I guess, very situational depending on the fight. The other interesting component is that his overhead does have a stacking component as well that increases in stack size every time his preemptive strike is triggered, which is why his preemptive strike is the biggest part of his kit. Once his stacks reaches 10, which is after he has done 10 preemptive strikes, he will get access to Reaper's Gale, which replaces his HP attack, and this attack represents the first instance of rainbow damage in the global version of the game. The JP version of the game only got access to this upon the release of Setzer, and I cannot emphasize enough how useful rainbow damage can be. Rainbow damage in essence is a fixed damage multiplier, so that when an attack does rainbow damage, the brave component of the attack is always capped at the maximum brave damage that the character can do. So if the character has, for example, the high armor and can do more than 10,000 brave damage, he will do that 10,000 damage in the rainbow attack, and this bypasses all forms of defense, attack down debuffs the character may have, or even brave resistance auras that the boss can have. Even, for example, in cases like in Kieran's Lufenia, which is very notorious, or very recently in Bard's Lufenia as well, where you see the 999% brave damage resistance and you needed to rely on instant break. Rainbow damage actually bypasses that, and he will still do maximum brave damage with Reaper's Gale even when the bosses have the 999% damage brave resistance aura up. It's also an instant turn rate and it doesn't have a turn count, which means that if you need to reapply his buffs to either himself or the ally, you can still use Reaper's Gale and then use his skill 1, skill 2 or his EX to reapply his buffs. The other good thing about this attack is that it also replaces his HP attack. So if the fight has certain HP percentages that will trigger brave damage resistances, such as 79% or 49% having the brave damage resistance, you can actually store his Reaper's Gale for a couple of turns, wait until the brave damage resistance is up, and use his Reaper's Gale as a means to break the bosses then, so long as they have enough maximum brave that his attacks can overcome. So he will be coming up the day after this video is released, which is on July 28th, and he will be featured on a banner with Leo's BT again. At this point, the developers have not announced who his banner mates will be, so that part is still a question. The first multi-draw will be free, and he will come with a limited time gem and costume bundle. So for those who still lack Leo's BT weapon, this is welcome news, because if you decide to pull for Cor, you still have a chance to snag Leo's BT weapon in the process as well. So what does Cor actually bring to the table? Well, just from a high level overview, firstly, he does provide damage mitigation and break immunity for himself and one ally, and an additional 80% attack and max brave up to boot. He does do very strong off-turn damage, and he is the first character in the global version of the game to get access to rainbow damage, and I cannot emphasize how valuable this feature is, considering that Lufenia fights will be getting increasingly higher defenses and brave damage resistances. That being said though, he is somewhat of a complex character, and while he can perform decently well in almost any party setup, you will benefit the most by having specific setups that play to his strengths, specifically those that provides him as many follow-up attacks or preemptive strikes as possible, because this is a large part of his damage potential and his kit. Obviously, with experience from Terra and Young, this will notably mean that he excels with turn hoggers, but due to the fact that he also does his preemptive strike twice when the boss targets all, and he does it regardless if the boss is actually disabled or not, Cor does actually perform very well also in fights where bosses gets multiple turns, or the bosses frequently targets the entire party. Some notable combos that will work really well with Cor. First of all, you have your typical turn hoggers such as Ultimacia or Lightning, where due to the fact that they get multiple turns in a row, they also trigger his preemptive strikes multiple times in a row as well. I did not mention Terra here. Terra will also do very well with Cor, but the only thing about Terra versus Ultimacia or Lightning is that with Terra you typically want to spam her LD meteors in a row and not give other party members a turn. With Cor, ideally you want to give Cor a turn or two in between Terra's meteor spam, so that Cor can refresh his ally buff on her. Otherwise, his buff will wear off eventually and you will lose out on his preemptive strikes. Other notable combos, lock tanks, I think deserve special mention here, and to me the most notable one right now would be Warrior of Light. One, because he's recently featured and he did recently receive his LD boards as well, making him one of the best lock tanks in the game. But beyond that, his feature of having brave shields also play very well with Cor's 80% brave damage resistances. One of Warrior of Light's issues in the past is that because he locks all bosses onto him, his own shield tends to be depleted very quickly, suffering from the repeated attacks that the bosses make. With Cor on the table, he provides 80% brave damage resistance for Warrior of Light and an additional 30% defense up. This means that Warrior of Light's shield will remain significantly longer in play as well, which is a huge boost to Warrior of Light's value. Of course, with locked tanks, the key thing is that because all the bosses are locked on to the tank, you guarantee a preemptive strike every time the bosses gets a turn, which is ideal for Cor. Iroha, I think, deserves special mention, mainly on the basis that Iroha has a unique Brave Refund mechanic, and typically this translates to more damage on Cor's preemptive strikes, and over the long run of the fight translates to more damage overall. Last but certainly not least, and I think this deserves the highest mention, would be Eldnarch. Again, the key thing that differentiates Cor versus other follow-up attackers is that Cor's preemptive strike happens on the start of the turn, and would happen regardless if the boss is disabled or not. With Eldnarch, you can potentially disable the bosses the entire fight, which means that you can safely allow the bosses to get a turn and trigger Cor's follow-up attack. Not only that, most bosses, once locked by Terror, will not change their targets. So this means that if the boss happens to be targeting the entire party and Eldnarch inflicts all Terror on the bosses, this means that the boss will perpetually be locked onto the entire party, and this means that every time the bosses gets a turn, Cor will be preemptive striking twice. Not only that, Eldnarch also has the warp debuff and gets a free turn after the bosses gets a turn. So just imagine your typical scenario where you have two bosses in your standard Lufenia fights, both bosses are targeting all, and both bosses are terror locked by Eldnarch. Boss A gets a turn, is disabled, and gets attacked twice by Cor. Eldnarch then gets a free warp turn after that and will trigger Cor's follow-up attack. Boss B then gets a turn and is disabled but triggers Cor's attack 2 more times, and after boss BX, Eldnarch gets another free turn which triggers Cor's attack. This translates to 6 preemptive strikes over the course of 2 boss turns, which is actually huge for a character like Cor, and translates to significantly higher damage compared to other follow-up DPS characters. So I guess the golden question that many people will be asking themselves is, should I pull or not pull? Well, there's always multiple factors to take into consideration as always, and I always highlight this in my pull plan videos. And you should always consider, who you have built up in your current roster and your current level of resources. Personally, I am pulling for Cor. I've hoarded quite a bit of resources specifically for situations like this. And if you do have resources to spare, I think Cor does provide a great deal of value for your potential investment. So I think I would recommend pulling for him if you can spare the resources. Definitely he's not a must-have considering that he's a global first character. It means that the JP side of the game did fine without Cor all the while. So by no means he's a must-have. However, overall he's a very strong character, and I think his main value, at least to me, is that he opens up a new aspect of off-turn damage, which is very different from other characters who bring off-turn damage to the table. And to me, more variety and more strategies that I have access to is always welcome, because this means that I have more options when it comes to putting together a party for Lufenia fights. Overall, if you do plan to pull for Cor, I would recommend to strategize surrounding his strengths and try to build a party that can complement his preemptive strikes. If you do that, he does have a very high potential for disgustingly effective combos. And a very easy example that I can give is the Terra and Young combo, which I'm sure by now everyone would have either experienced or seen it in other videos. Cor does bring the same potential to the table, but with different situations and different party setups. So if you play to his strengths, you definitely will not be disappointed, and you'll be able to see Lufenia fights where he does a disgustingly insane high amount of damage between his turns. So that's it for this video. I hope it's been somewhat informative. And if you do decide to pull for him, or if you do have your own opinions on Cor, do feel free to share in the comment section as well. As always, if you enjoyed the video, do leave a like, comment or subscribe. It really helps a lot. Till then, I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye bye.